being here.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
And just to let people know who are listening, we've been having these Q&As every 2 weeks, but John's going back to his school schedule now, and so we will be going to a once-a-month schedule for these Q&As. They'll be held on the last Monday of the month, but we've extended from 1 hour to 90 minutes. So we have a little bit of extra time. And last time we took way too much time with talking, so let's get straight to the questions. We've got a question from Pedro, who isn't able to be here today, but he left his question. John, what do you think about self-hypnosis and autogenic training to help with focus, flow, and to deal with the monkey mind, especially for triggering and intrusive thoughts? Do you have good sources for these practices? Thanks.
Hypnotism is just to be clear, all hypnotism is ultimately self-hypnotism. Anybody who's hypnotizing is just providing you with some external cues and some mirroring and some redirection of attention so that you actually hypnotize yourself. And we also have to remember that all people are not equally hypnotizable, so there's variation that way. But hypnotizability seems to be heritable, which means and Matt Rossano argues this, it's plausible that it has been selected for across human evolution. I would argue probably with Matt Rossano back to the Upper Paleolithic transition. So it was probably enmeshed with shamanic healing, a capacity for being healed by shamans. And again, when I say that, I don't mean anything supernatural. I mean, the shaman is doing ritual behavior that can trigger self-hypnosis, that can magnify the placebo effect, and that's very, very powerful. In fact, it's pretty much the only significant healthcare you have, for the significant and effective healthcare you have for a very long time. So I think ignoring hypnotism in this overall project would be a mistake. Now, for a long time, there was that. So that was that's an evolutionary psychology argument. Some people still doubt its existence. I think that's no longer a plausible leg to stand upon. People were saying individuals are faking it. But then Amir Raz did a bunch of and he got, Canada Research Chair, just did a whole bunch of amazing experimental work showing that you could hypnotize people to overcome the Stroop effect and all kinds of other automatic processing, cognitive processing, and attentional processing that people cannot override, even with belief, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody is now basically flipped because of that very seminal research to come to the conclusion that hypnotism is a real phenomena. It's all self-hypnotism. Now, Amir Raz and Michael Lifshitz published a book on hypnosis and meditation, or hypnosis and mindfulness, Oxford University Press. And myself and Leo Ferraro have a paper in there called Reformulating the Mindfulness Construct. And we picked up on some work by Amir Raz and also by a colleague of mine, Norman Farb. Norman Farb pointed out that most, if you take a careful look at the instructions people are giving in mindfulness classes, guiding people into a mindfulness state, and I do that all the time. Many of you know that I do the weekday morning meditation contemplation classes. Norman Farb pointed out that those instructions are very similar, very, very similar to hypnotic induction. And so there seems, what Leo and I argued is there seems to be a connection, a causal interdependence between hypnotism, the power of suggestion, and mindfulness, the power of attention, and they can actually interford and interpenetrate each other. And we in fact strongly suggested, building on that evolutionary argument from Matt Rossano that I was just talking about a couple of minutes ago, that in shamanic ritual you had these two things together, so that you have something like hypnotism affording and strengthening people's ability to get into mindfulness states, and then mindfulness really increasing people's ability to enter into states of absorption and flow that increase their capacity for being hypnotized. And so I do think I do think there's a good scientific basis now for trying to parse out and then put back together a relationship between mindfulness and hypnotizability. That's what we argued in that paper in the book, the chapter in that book. So what that means specifically is, I think the place, I would argue the place we need to look for how to put those two together is within the effects of ritual on cognition, paying attention for and perhaps experimentally manipulating mindfulness variables and hypnotism variables. So I think, I'd like to do that, and I'd like to do that moving forward. And then I'd like to integrate that with work done by Nick Wickelman and others about the use of metaphor and an analogy in the language of coaching and how you actually train people, because it borders on both mindfulness and hypnotism, because you give these people these inactive metaphors. You tell them, run, sprint, but sprint as if you're running up a hill, or be a spring as you're moving around. And people sort of enact this, and all these kinds of bizarre things that we take as sort of natural. But Nick's done a lot of work pulling out the role of sort of inactive perspectival and participatory imagination. So I think all three of these need to be studied. Nobody's doing it. And then that leads me to my second part of my answer, which I can't recommend any good practical work on this, precisely because I think that most of the practical manuals, I haven't read them all, and I'm largely ignorant. So this is something of a mixture of a supposition and conjecture. I think because this emerging science was not available to the people who have written all these books about hypnotism, that these books are seriously out of date and probably obsolete. So I would hesitate to recommend any of them. What I can predict is that much better applications of hypnotism should be coming down the pipe as this further scientific work on the relationships between hypnotism and mindfulness, which is already going. And then also I would propose the relationships between hypnotism, mindfulness, and things like coaching, imagination, using imagination, enacted imagination in coaching as that starts to unfold. So it's a long answer, I think, but the point is that's a really, really interesting phenomenon. And I have published on it because I do think it's an important thing to consider.
All right, thank you. Velaskin, you had a question last time that we didn't get to.
Yeah, I was sort of wondering whether or not to ask it, but it's nice and quick. So, John, I noticed the qualifications that you've gotten to do the work that you're doing seems to be, at least online, is basically a cognitive science bachelor's degree and then all the way up to PhD in philosophy.
Right.
I was wondering, if I wanted to get into your work, would you recommend doing a load of philosophy, or could I just sort of do cognitive science bachelor's, then maybe like a master's in philosophy of mind, and then what's your advice?
Yeah, that's great. So the way it worked, is because U of T doesn't have a graduate cog sci program. I actually did my PhD basically in cognitive science. That's my thesis is actually entitled "The Naturalistic Imperative in Cognitive Science," but I had to formally do it within philosophy. So my career went, I got a BA and an MA in sort of pure philosophy, and I realized what I wanted to zero in on, and I got the honors BSc in cognitive science, and then I went back and did my PhD basically in cognitive science. I would recommend just do straight cognitive science. You're going to be doing a lot of philosophy in that, and there are now graduate programs in cognitive science that are quite good. Andy Clark's in Edinburgh is very good. We have one in Canada at Carleton University in Ottawa. I know it'll be cold. Well, I guess it won't be. It's probably going to be online for a while. But those are two excellent places in which you can do graduate work. Now, that being said, I recommend, and this is how the CogSci program is actually designed at the University of Toronto. So it's designed so that you do a double major. You do cognitive science and you major in another discipline one of the home disciplines like psychology or computer science or philosophy or linguistics. So I recommend that all the way through, definitely in your undergrad, do a double major, outside, like philosophy, if that's the thing you're most interested in. And then as you go through your graduate degree, make sure you do try and get as much of that doubling all the way along. The research shows that if you have just pure cog sci, you will be outcompeted by, like if you try to get a job in a psych department or something like that, you'll be outcompeted by somebody who has a pure psych PhD. But the same research shows that if you have a cog sci and psych degree, you will outcompete the person that has just the psych degree, especially if the department is much more cognitively oriented. So I hope that's helpful feedback for you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Great, Struan, you have a question.
Hi, John.
Hey, Struan.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. It's a little bit hectic for me right now because I'm going in, as Brett mentioned, to teaching the 4 courses, which is more than a full course load. I'm now the director of the cognitive science program at the University of Toronto. That's chewing up a lot of my time and energy. So feeling a little spread thin, but otherwise lots of good stuff happening. Had a joyous time talking with Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Pajot. Also had a really fun time talking with Jordan Hall and Greg Enriquez. So I'm also I may be burning the candles at both ends, but there's at least some really shiny bits in that. So
yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation with Paul and Jonathan. I'm not sure if I've seen is this a recent one with Jordan Hall and Greg?
Oh,
Enriquez,
I haven't put it on my channel yet. Sorry, Jordan released that on his channel.
Okay, so I'll check that out. Anyway, did you get my email with my question? Because I just realized it's a bit of a mouthful. Sorry?
I did, and I did a quick read of it. But so you want to talk to me about panpsychism in contrast to continuity, and proposing something sort of alternative to what J.P. Marceau has proposed. So please.
Yeah, okay. So I was going to read it out. I've been very interested in your conversations with J.P. Marceau regarding panpsychism versus deep continuity. Recently, you mentioned that strong emergence is something that many people find hard to credit, and I would have to count myself as being among that group. However, you did say that panpsychism had similar weaknesses with respect to the interplay of mind and matter, and that this makes it hard to judge which of the two theories is superior. So given that I also fall into the panpsychist camp, I would like to propose something to you. And I would like to invite you to take your best shot at undermining it. You said that the weakness that Sorry?
I was just laughing, Struan. Please continue.
Okay. You said that the weakness that panpsychism has is that it isn't clear why inanimate objects such as rocks don't have conscious experience. Or basically, if matter is supposed to possess some form of consciousness, it isn't obvious how these rudimentary consciousnesses are supposed to combine to give us self-awareness. Does my summary more or less get the gist of your position?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that last point because it seems to me that panpsychism, like you, and I think you're being an accurate representative, they criticize deep continuity because they reject strong emergence. But it seems to me that they invoke some version of strong emergence when they say something like self-awareness and consciousness strongly emerges out of all the micro consciousnesses that don't possess intelligence and self-awareness. And so that's, for me, that undermines why I would choose panpsychism over deep continuity. If both have to rely on strong emergence, then the first seems to have a much more conservative ontology going for it and is much more in concert with sort of existing scientific ontology. So that's sort of the argument. I think I said the same thing, but I just want to put a few points of emphasis on it.
Yeah, okay, so that's great. I thought you'd put it better than I could. And yeah, I basically agree with everything that you said there. So what I would like to propose is the idea that space itself is the panpsych, which is to say that under this hypothesis, space locates matter by each of it. I think that making this move...
was strong.
Sorry?
Can you say the last two sentences again? You broke up for me. I don't know if you broke up for other people. Maybe your mic was being moved or something. Like I didn't get it. I just didn't hear it. What did you just say? The last two sentences?
Okay. So what I would like to propose is the idea that space itself is the panpsych, which is to say that under this hypothesis, space locates matter by being conscious of it. You with me?
So far.
Okay. I think that this move removes several of the weaknesses of the form of panpsychism that JP advocated. First of all, while I can say that I've seen matter, I can't say that I've ever seen space. Space is as much a conceptual abstraction to me as your mind is. I have no reason to think that I have direct experience of either. However, scientific observation shows that space and matter indeed interact in some manner. Specifically, as Einstein put it, space tells matter how to move and matter tells space how to bend. But I would like to add to that observation by stating that matter potentially also fuses space in the form of singularities, otherwise known as black holes.
Sure.
If matter can bend and fuse space, then could it not also perhaps break space? And could this breaking of space not somehow form the basis of consciousness as we know it? I've got one more paragraph there. I don't know if you want to cut in there or not.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll cut in here, but I'll try not to sort of overwhelm you with a wave of words, so you get a chance to come to your last paragraph. Let's take a. I mean, this was actually proposed, and by all people, it was proposed by Newton, the Leibniz-Clark debate, in which Clark, who was basically just a puppet for Newton, was debating Leibniz, and Newton actually proposed something like that space was the sensorium of God, and then people all jumped on him for being a heretic. And the arguments are somewhat similar. There seems to be an element of Berkeley's idea too in there, or maybe Hume. So when you say you can't see space, so I mean a traditional response to that is, well, you don't see space, you see motion, and that is to see space. So you see extension in things that are not moving, and you see and you see movement in things that aren't moving, and then the category that makes sense of them together is space. So are you saying that set? Oh, let me ask you a question, then I'll shut up. That second move of going from extension in things and being aware of motion, and then saying, okay, there's space because of that. That's a pure abstraction. It's not something that you directly experience. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, it's something like Hume's argument with respect to causality, that you can't ever experience causality, right? So, in other words, you shouldn't expect empirical proof for this. Well, I shouldn't necessarily expect to have empirical proof for your mind if there's a barrier that cuts it off, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't have a mind.
Right. And so, I mean, sort of the response, right, that's come, post Quine and Davidson, right, out of that is, well, the problem with Hume's standard of empirical evidence is you end up having empirical evidence for nothing. You end up in Humean skepticism. And then they point out that in science, most empirical evidence is for non-directly experiential things, right?
Right. So, but I'm saying, so you can, as you make the move with space, you make the move with mind. And we don't know exactly what space is. We can only speculate using mental abstractions and formulations. We can't ever, at least today, we don't know of a test that allows us to directly perceive the fabric of space itself. It's a mystery to us.
Okay. But again, that same argument would work for bacteria, right? Or at least up till recently when we had, microscopes, because we could only infer their existence, but they turned out to be real, right?
Well, I expect you're not doubting the reality of consciousness or space, right? We know that, or we act as if both of these phenomena are real.
Okay, I think I just misunderstood you. I think when you said I take empirical evidence to be anything that provides, a basis for inferences to theoretical entities. Because, like I said,
okay, no, I might be being a little bit more strict then with my definition of empirical. Yeah.
So
Okay.
I do think, just like I think there's empirical evidence for dinosaurs, living dinosaurs. I think there's empirical evidence for space. That's what I'm saying. Something like that.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think my last paragraph will speak to this directly, and then anyway. So while I understand,
go ahead. You just said go ahead.
While I understand that I've done nothing to explain the mystery of the interaction of matter and consciousness, I think that if we ever gain the means to investigate the equally mysterious relationship of space and matter, that the idea that I propose to you may well become something that we can test for in a falsifiable manner. And as a bonus, I think this way of dealing with the consciousness problem would still be amenable to accounting for the world in terms of T and M information and the bridge of intelligibility between them, which is, I believe, what you're using deep continuity to actually do.
I'm just going to steel man your argument a bit. I mean, this is increased by the move. It's not reached consensus, but it's a powerful move within physics. Information realism, to regard information as a fundamental ontological building block along with matter and energy, space and time. And the reason you have to do this is precisely because of paradoxes around black holes and other other situations in which our normal conceptions of space and time are being warped, to use Star Trek language, I suppose. So that lends some initial plausibility to what you're saying. I don't know how else to respond to it, Strawn. Like I said, I do think that, you have some historical precedent. Plotinus thought that everything is contemplating, even inanimate things, and he had a really interesting way of understanding that. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think I could jump in there, because from your book, Cognitive Science and Buddhism lectures, when you were describing the formal cause, you used the idea that form is kind of like shape, but it doesn't mean exactly shape. And I think while you were doing that, because you were trying to allude to the structural functional organization. But what my response to you there is that I think that there is an argument to be made that space is exactly the formal cause, and so therefore the space is shapeness itself, right?
Yeah.
So
and the fact that if we both agree that space exists, then space is a real potential in that way. Yes, a real formal cause, not just a conjectured possible thing. Right?
Well, I would say a real possibility. I prefer to. Yeah, I prefer to talk of time in terms of potentiality. So, but I don't know. That might just be a bit nitpicky, and besides the point for this conversation. I don't know.
I don't have. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I was using potentiality because we were invoking the Aristotelian framework.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, well, yeah, I think that's right, and I think there's something deeply analogous between sort of the way things. This is a Whiteheadian argument. The way things are constantly moving from indeterminacy to determinacy, and they are regulated by that kind of formal causation, and that's analogous to something like relevance realization and intelligence. And I've also argued there's important continuity between intelligence and consciousness. And if we throw in informational realism, I'm trying to make your argument more plausible in my own mind. I hope you understand that.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I'm not convinced, but I think it's now a position I already take it seriously. I already take panpsychism seriously, but now even more so. That's what I can say, at least at this moment.
Right. The one extra point that I could put in there, just to tie it in with your stuff, is that I very much see space as a perspective on matter. So it's like, well, matter there would be more propositional to me.
Yeah, that's Plotinus. That's very much Plotinus. Of course, he doesn't have our notion of matter. He has that, on bodies, he would say, but very, very similar, very, very analogous. what's the name of it? Is it that there on nature contemplation in the one? There's an excellent book on that Aeneid. I'm trying to remember the author. Sorry. Anyways, the author wrote a book, an extended commentary on Plotinus's Aeneid, nature contemplation of the one, in which he goes into that idea about everything is engaged in an act of contemplation. You might find that very very useful. I've always found it something I keep returning back to, because I do think that's one of Plotinus's more profound Aeneids. So maybe take a look at it and see if that gives you something you could talk to me about in the future.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, so and the only thing that I left out there was, with all this in mind, what's the most cunning philosophical jiu-jitsu that you can muster against this idea. But we've taken a lot of time, and I think I'll take your steel manning instead.
Okay, that's fine. You do, like I said, I don't see, and you admitted this up front, so I'm not trying to pigeonhole you or jiu-jitsu at all. Like I said, I don't think that resolves the issue that I had about the competition between deep continuity and panpsychism. But maybe it does.
Well,
but I don't see that right now.
Yeah, I would just say that I think that it's this. If space is the panpsych, then whatever way matter breaks space, it's not a strong emergence; it's a weak emergence in that case. And I think that's the advantage.
Okay, but I think we should. I think we can go back and forth on this. Okay, so maybe we should leave it here. And I don't want to.
Right.
I'll leave you with the last word. To be fair to you.
Yeah. Well, I'll think it over some more and get back to you and check out Plotinus, and maybe I'll have something more useful to say then.
That's good.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks. You had a question last time that we didn't get to.
Me?
Yeah, Ben. Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, I see. So I saw from the list that you have in text, Brett, that I was next up there, but I was hesitant to assume because I didn't hear the name. Well, hi, John. Just incidentally, from that last question you were answering with Strawn, that book you mentioned, that wouldn't happen to be the one by a certain John Deck, would it be?
So did I remember it correctly? I said that, and then I thought, and then I got a memory error signal coming up inside of me. Yeah, that would be it. That's okay. It, I think.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can confirm that, having just looked it up.
Okay, thank you. Oh, my memory was accurate.
Thanks,
wow, that's
Ben.
good.
So the question that I've been hoping to ask you last week, I have some awareness that maybe it's malformed or misframed, but I'm pretty confident that you'll be able to answer it in a way that's productive. What I was wondering is, from your perspective as a cognitive scientist and as an educator, if you have any general advice to people about how to appropriate and optimize their process of learning. And what I have in mind here especially is Jordan Hall's idea about trying to emulate special forces in the sense of getting that ongoing adaptability.
Yeah, I think that's very, very important, what Jordan said. So thank you for bringing that out. I'm actually trying to finish up. It's mostly written and done. Book on plausibility, understanding, and pedagogy, called Plausibility and Pedagogy. And so from the teacher's side, I've been trying to argue for shifting the emphasis from knowledge to understanding, because trying to get people to be retainers of knowledge, I'm not saying we should stop doing that, but trying to make that the primary thing we do in education is bloody obsolete. And COVID has made that even more relevant. Right? And the universities, I see them struggling to try and catch up, because when a lot of the evaluation is still from the paper and pencil era, in which you see how much information people have stored in their otherwise fallible memory, And once we get into COVID, that becomes completely irrelevant because, of course, on those kinds of tests, people could just massively cheat. And academic dishonesty is skyrocketing right now around that. So a lot of people are just struggling. I'm taking a, sorry, I should calm down. My tone is taking on, I'm taking on the tone of vindication, which is a little bit hubristic. But I do think an emphasis on understanding, and I think this goes along with what Jordan is saying, is much more crucial. And then that has to do with two things I talked about at length, but I talk about even more at length in the book. I talked about them in the video series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is plausibility and relevance realization and enhancing that, and figuring, and then doing it in a way in which you enhance the cycle that's found within deep learning within neural networks. You want to get a convergence that compresses to some kind of construct upon which you have optimal grip, that then elegantly projects into and transfers to many different domains and introduces variation that then feeds back in, and you get deep learning. And that kind of balance between deep convergence, deep elegance, in plausibility, I argue, is how you basically turn knowledge into understanding by tracing out ways in which different pieces of information, different pieces of knowledge are relevant to each other in convergence, relevant to each other in elegance, and relevant to each other in the higher order balancing between convergence and elegance. So, and I have actually been explicitly teaching that way. And what that involves very much is the convergence side. It's two different aspects of sort of the Socratic method. The convergence side is the method of considering many possibilities, intensifying the problem until you get a convergence to a good problem formulation, and then you use that to then trigger convergence towards a proposed answer, from which you then want something like a Socratic insight for how it's virtuous, how it can be applied in many different contexts. So that's the method I've actually been using in the teaching of my courses. And I justify it, again, in terms of the notion that plausibility is the normative standard we should be using. Certainty is not a relevant standard anymore. And in many ways, any of our claims to certainty presuppose plausibility. Let me give you a quick example of what I mean, like empirical investigation. Okay, so I can't consider all possible hypotheses. I filter for the plausible ones. And then when I'm designing my experiment, I can't control for all possible confounds. I filter for the plausible ones. And then once I get my results, I can't derive all of the implications. So I filter for the plausible ones. So plausibility is presupposed before, during, and after any empirical investigation. So if we understand plausibility and understanding, if we promote and emphasize training people more explicitly to generate plausibility and thereby create deeper understanding, profounder understanding, I think that is actually the tool that is going to make what they've learned relevant to how things are changing right now. It's so giving people a way to increase their capacity for understanding and filtering information in terms of plausibility. I think that's most important and relevant right now. So that demands that we emphasize a whole bunch of different sets of skills than we have typically emphasized in education. So capacities for abduction, capacities for insight, capacities for reframing, capacities for wonder as opposed to just curiosity. So in order to open up your framing to significant self-correction, all of these things then take a more central role in pedagogy. Did that answer your question at all, Ben? I said a lot. I don't know if any.
Well, do you mind if I follow up just a bit?
Please.
Well, so I'm noticing the affinities with Zach Stein and James Carson's work, of course, in when you're ending on there. So it's a bit like what you laid out there was part of the design criteria for sort of innovating pedagogy to equip people with the normativity of plausibility. Is that so? But I'm also wondering, and this is sort of another front, maybe, or another angle of the question is how can people go about figuring out what is relevant for them to learn? If you know where I'm going with that, just given the sort of vastness of what's available.
So that's, I mean, and what you're of course alluding to here is the relevance problem, the frame problem.
Right.
There's so much out there, you don't know what's going to turn out to be relevant in the long term. So now I can't give you a deductive, inductive argument. I can give you at most an aspirational argument for this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's all we've ever been given. And it's just that now that things are happening so rapidly, this, what I just said, has now been made much more explicit.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, and so this is for me the Socratic thing, and you know, and the Stoics basically made this argument: cultivate wisdom and virtue. And I argued that, you know, virtue is the beauty of wisdom. Each virtue is a way of being wise in a particular context. You know, it's a way of appropriately seeing what's the most relevant information in this context that needs to be done. Organized ultimately around the meaningful life and human flourishing. Cultivate the virtues that reduce self-deception and enhance meaning in life. And then, you know, cultivate what surrounds that and afford it for you. And then cultivate what surrounds that and affords that for you. So I'm proposing sort of, you know, expanding concentric circles. And this is how I've tried to do it. And I see a lot of people doing that, these people that I'm talking to. And I think, where did I argue this? I can't remember. I think this is a version of how we can make much better, you know, Campbell's notion of following your bliss, which tends to be just massively misinterpreted in sort of a hedonistic or romantic fashion. I think if you find everybody, I think that should start with the perennial practices of reducing self-deception and enhancing meaning in life, and then find those things that fit their particular historical, cultural context, their environmental context, their own idiosyncratic psychodynamic history, and their personality variables, so that they can build a surrounding set of affording practices and hobbies or vocations or professions, and then build upon those, et cetera, et cetera. And why I'm recommending that is, first of all, on one hand, it has, I think, a higher, one of the higher chances of being successful because these perennial patterns are constitutive of human well-being, and therefore they should always be inherently valuable. And secondly, because the skills that are attendant to it, like rationality and wonder and aspiration, are precise. Rationality more broadly construed, right? As I've argued, these are also the skills that seem to be the most reliably generalizable across changing contexts and situations. Then, you know, and then if you take a look at, you do the reverse, you take a look at people's lives who have gone well or are going well, they tend to have that sort of structure where they've got sort of reliable skills and habits and virtues, meaning in life and reducing self-deception, and then they sort of build outward upon those in that supporting fashion. Now, of course, that is not a deterministic thing. I just said people get lucky, people lots of people who get lucky, lots of people who do what I just said, suffer ill fate. We are only human beings. We're not gods, and the universe is indifferent to our narrative projects, mostly. So I think how you zero in on what's relevant is what's virtuous and meaningful, and then what supports that, and then what supports the support, etc. That's how I would answer that.
So it sounds like there's almost an anagogic resonance between the supports of wisdom and virtue and pushing forward to the horizon and coming back and cultivating.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that would be, I mean, I didn't make that argument. That'd be a third argument. What I proposed, and you picked up on it very well, thank you, is, that has a high plausibility of getting you to sort of experience the sacred through sort of reciprocal opening and anagogic resonance and aspirational self-transcendence. And all of those seem to make lives better and make the people living them better in ways that seem, again, cross-contextually, cross-historically validated. So,
so just one last thing. As far as reading for getting a plausible understanding of plausibility, I'm supposing that would be Elia Milgram's work.
Sorry, this is I think the book that's coming out is going to be that I'm writing. I think is the best. Because what it does is it takes Rescher's work and Milgram's work, and also the stuff from deep learning, and sort of puts it all together into, well, a plausible argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
A plausible integrated argument. But those are the people like Milgram and Rescher. There's a new book out called Plausible Reasoning, but it hasn't. And then there's lots of good books on the other side on understanding, anthologies. Recht has some books on understanding. There's an anthology from, I think, 2013 on scientific understanding. There's some very good anthologies out there on the philosophy and psychology of understanding. It's mostly coming out of the philosophy of science. But if you want sort of, but what I've tried to do is draw all that literature together into a single argument in a single text.
I'm sort of just looking for what to read in the meantime, I suppose.
Yeah. If maybe we could work out a way in which I could email you the draft as it exists on the understanding, and then that also has an extensive bibliography in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That way you'd get both the draft and the bibliography. I would need from you some kind of statement, just an email or something that
right.
You won't share it or etc. or
right,
cite from it. It hasn't been published.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be happy to do that.
Wow. Well then, I suppose I'll email you about that then, or that would be really great.
Let's make that happen. That'd be good.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for proposing that.
Like I said, as long as in the email you formally state my conditions, then there we go. That'd be great.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, John, and as always, I appreciate your taking the time. And
that's something that I'm really putting a lot of thought into right now. I have so many things that are 90% done, and I'm trying to bring them to fruition, but I'm just incredibly busy right now. So the rate at which things are coming to completion is I think is slowed down a bit. So that's why I've got to free up some space so I can finish up these other things which will in turn free up more space. At least that's the fantasy I tell myself.
Right, and there are new projects coming in the meanwhile. And
of course, yeah.
So I suppose I'll pass the floor back to Brett.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks. The last two people on our backup list aren't here, so if you guys were holding off adding yourself to the queue because you thought we'd run out of time, we have an extended time tonight. We're going till another 40 minutes or so. Please add yourself to the list. Valerie, you are up next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. I really appreciated your lecture series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I learned a lot from it. And I also enjoyed your latest discussion with Jonathan Bichot and Paul Vandeclay. That was very lively and informative. I really didn't understand eminence and from the bottom up, from the top down thing. I had a more of a personal question, and you may not feel comfortable answering this. If not, please ignore it. But I was just kind of curious, what got you into cognitive science?
So that's actually a big. I'm happy to answer it. It's a somewhat convoluted thing. So I was brought up within a very fundamentalist Christian upbringing, and then in my teens, I basically rejected that because I encountered some very profound and thought-provoking world literature. It sort of broke things open for me. But that, of course, brought with it, I guess, my own extreme version of something like a meaning crisis. And I went looking around, and I entered into university, and I took a philosophy course, and I met the figure of Socrates and the work of Plato, and this had a profound impact on me. And I saw in that something that I was hungering for, this topic of wisdom, self-examination, a life of aspiration and virtue. And those topics really, really moved me profoundly. And I decided to take that up. But as I went further, in fact, not that much further in academic philosophy, all of that whole Socratic project of the cultivation of wisdom and the topic of wisdom fell off the table. You couldn't even take a course when I was in undergrad on the Stoics or the Neoplatonists. That's how truncated things were, and it was all about knowledge and epistemology, and not about wisdom and the love of it. And so that I got very disillusioned. In one sense, I came to really value the meta science and the cultural critique that academic philosophy was affording me. So I continued on, and I got my MA. But by that time, I became very sort of disenchanted with that project. And I actually left school for a year, and I fell into a pretty dark state. And then I sort of committed myself to finding somewhere else where I could start to cultivate wisdom. And I took up Tai Chi Chuan and Vipassana meditation and meta contemplation and related practices. And I started to practice these very deeply, and they was just having a profound transformation on me. There's overlap. I'm presenting it like it's a nice clean sequence, but it's muddied and overlapping. But I'm cleaning it up for the purposes of narrative. And so I started to pursue that, and then I realized that there was a new discipline that was starting to talk about mind, body, and mind, right, and consciousness, at least in ways that are not the same as this interest I was having in wisdom, was at least closer to it than academic philosophy. That was cognitive science. So I decided to take it up. And as I was taking it up, I started to get more and more into it. But cognitive science was itself going through a change. What was starting to happen is that cognitive science, and then very close to it, cognitive psychology, were starting to come around where they were talking about consciousness and altered states of consciousness and rationality, and then very soon wisdom. The book on wisdom came out in 1990, edited by Robert Sternberg. So all of a sudden, all these topics that I was learning about where I was cultivating wisdom were now in cognitive science and cognitive psychology. So those two just came together for me, and they started reinforcing each other. And then it just became, it went from something I was studying to a vocation. I had a sense of being called to this. because of that convergence and the way it seemed such of a kairos. It seemed to resonate with my students, and then seems to start, and then that sense of resonating with the culture at large started to grow on me, and so that's how it happened.
Wow, cool. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. One last thing I'd like to share with you is I know you probably heard this a lot, but the agape section in your lecture, that really blew me away. I've never heard anyone articulate it so perfectly before. And I really enjoyed your lecture series, and the history was very fascinating. I never finished college, so it was probably the best college course I could take online to learn all of that from you. So thank you very much for your work, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you for saying that. That episode on agape, I mean, there's several episodes in the series that touch me very personally, but that episode touches me maybe one of the deepest, which is, and I care a lot about it, not just because I think agape is important. So the shareable reason, the reason I can share with other people, is I think agape is tremendously important, and I've made lots of arguments about why that's the case. But for me, and I don't want to be presumptuous about anybody's religious orientation or affiliation. I always try to be very respectful of that. But for me, and I'm just speaking for me on this point, that was a way in which it was a culmination of a long process of trying to reappreciate Jesus of Nazareth as, for me, a sage figure, and to make to recover from my religious past something of the man and his teaching, and so that was for me also a personally healing episode.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's very insightful, and it took years for you to figure that out. Yeah.
So thank you for saying that, and thank you for your encouragement. It's much appreciated.
You're welcome, and thank you. I'll turn the baton over to whoever's next.
This may be a good segue to talking. You talked about how you started your ecology of practices, John. Maybe you could just expand on the importance of an ecology of practice and talk about what's going on now in the meditation course, which is expanded beyond meditation to the wisdom of Hypatia, and maybe tell us a bit about what's going on there and the importance of it.
Thank you, Brett, for that opportunity to do so. I appreciate that. So yeah, I mean, I was, as I mentioned to Valerie, I was taught an ecology of practice, and it took me quite a while to retrospectively understand the pedagogical profundity of that, and how it afforded the transformation. And then the cognitive science I was learning about cognitive complexification and exaptation and cognitive flexibility just all converged with that. And, so the idea of an ecology of practices is that any psychotechnology has, strengths and weaknesses, and what you want to do. Each psychotechnology is, in some sense, affording you some capacity for self-correction, like mindfulness, self-correction of attention, for example. But that can be undermined by the fact that psychotechnology can, to some degree, also be a source of bias, of misdirection, etc. And so you want psychotechnological practices to be put into opponent processing. So you're getting a higher order, a more comprehensive form of self-correction. So one of the ones I offer, for example, is, mindfulness practices tend to afford insight, and they tend to reduce your inferential processing. But they tend to increase the insight machinery, and that's a very good thing. The problem with the insight machinery is that's also the same machinery by which you jump to conclusions and you give in more quickly to your intuitions. And so that needs to be counterbalanced with things like active open-mindedness, which tend to dampen down that machinery and increase and foreground the inferential. The problem with pure active open-mindedness is it can get you into a rigidity, a locking in of your framing, an inability to afford insight. And so they have respective strengths and weaknesses, and you need to have them together. Within mindfulness, you need meditative practices that are designed to get you to step back and reflect on the patterns and processes of your mind. And they need to be counterbalanced with contemplative practices that get you to look through that reframing and see if you can realize deeper patterns in the world. So what you have is and it's like an ecology, you have these nested relationships at different scales in which things need to be put into opponent processing so they counterbalance and mutually afford and constrain each other. So at a very high level, what we're doing in the Sangha, so within the Sangha, we were already pursuing that. The Sangha is what I refer to, that's the community that has built up around morning meditation class. So I taught people, Vipassana meditation, and then I taught them a contemplative practice, which is metta, and then I taught them how to put them together into a kind of opponent processing that actually exapts into a higher state, prajna. But I also taught them how to balance all these seated, non-moving forms of mindfulness with moving practices. And so you can see that what's happening is a complexification of multi-scaled opponent processing and ecology. But all of those things are really centered on various aspects of mindfulness. And if you remember what I said earlier, the problem with all of these mindfulness practices is they need to be counterbalanced by other kinds of practices, like AOM. And active open-mindedness is basically drawn from Stoicism. And Stoicism is one of the wisdom traditions within the West. We're making use of a book right now. So we have these these practices, an ecology of practices drawn from the Eastern traditions, drawn from Buddhism, Vipassana, Metta, drawn from Taoism, Tai Chi, Qigong, Yichuan, Zhanzheng. And now we're now going through the Western wisdom traditions. The Buddha is sort of an exemplary figure for the Eastern traditions. Socrates is the exemplary figure from the Western traditions. And we're actually going through, we're going through McClelland's book, The Wisdom of Hypatia, which is basically a course where primary school is Epicureanism and the Epicurean practices. And then you graduate from that into high school where you learn the Stoicism and the Stoic practices that I mentioned earlier. And then you graduate from that into the Neoplatonic practices. And so you get so that's sort of, you go primary school to high school to sort of university level. Then, and each one it compensates and corrects and builds and deepens, it complexifies. And so what you end up with is a rich ecology of practices drawn from the Western tradition. And I agree with Arthur Vervaeke that Neoplatonism is the sort of cultural, cognitive, historical grammar of Western spirituality. Neoplatonism is how you get, it's how you get Christian mysticism. It's how you get Islamic mysticism and Sufism. It's how you get things like Kabbalah and Judaism, etc. And of course, it was for a long time, either publicly or under persecution, in hiding. It was also just itself an independent spiritual tradition. And so the idea is to give people that huge Western stream ecology of practices. And then at a very high level, you have this opponent processing between the Eastern and Western orientations. And so you get a very high level capacity for self-correction and for aspiration. At the same time, you get a rich reservoir of practices that allow for a very significant pluralism, while also giving people shared processes, shared language, shared way of communicating and communing together. And I think this is perhaps very helpful for a pluralistic world going through rapid historical, socioeconomic, and cultural change. Brett, was that okay? Did that sort of do it?
Yeah, that's great. And for anybody who's listening now who hasn't been following along on YouTube for the last number of months, is it too late for them to start getting into your course?
No. I don't think so. So one of the things that Amar, my good friend and my technical advisor, and then also my son Jason, what we've been doing is we have recorded all of the lessons. So in fact, we've recorded every single session. We've recorded all the lessons, and what you can do is you can go in and like do the lessons. Do 1 or 2, maybe even 3 lessons a week. Probably 2 is best. And then work your way through. But then as you're doing that, you could meet in and start. Where we are in the wisdom of Hypatia. There's lots of resources by which lots of people have done this. We try to pace things out. They've started at all different times and been able to catch up and integrate in. So I don't think that would preclude people at all.
And we've been meeting at 9:30 in the morning along with you here in the Discord, many of us, to do your course with you, to meditate, and to talk about it. And of course, we're starting to add. Well, we're going to be adding very soon a new exercise that's going to take place on the Discord or coordinated through the Discord in terms of, what do you call it, philosophical fellowship?
Yeah, it's philosophical contemplative companionship. It's sort of one of the core group practices that I think is inspired by Epicureanism. It would at least belong to what I would call extended Epicureanism. Yes.
And so, can you just talk really briefly about what that we will be dividing into groups, and then what we'd be doing together?
So what? Yeah. One thing is to recommend people check out Meditating with John Vervaeke, the class I gave on Friday, and the class I gave today. If they wanted to get a little less quick, a little bit longer, like more extensive presentation. But the basic idea is learning a way of reading and speaking about. Sorry, that's the wrong word. Erase what I just said. I was building a contrast in my mind, and then I blurted out the wrong thing. Very often we think about things and we speak about them and we speak to people. And that's very useful for all kinds of reasons. What you want to learn to do is instead not to about a text, but learn how to think through it. Some short philosophical text as a way of picking up the way that person thought, like how Plato thought or how Spinoza thought. Because a good way of thinking about this is most of our deepest aspirational learning and transformation comes from role modeling. I mean, you probably heard this. I heard it a lot growing up as a kid. Kids pay a lot more attention to what you do than what you say because they imitate you. They try to see things the way you see them. And that's how they work. Whereas they pay precious little, especially in the teen years, to what you say. So as the child is to the adult is to the sage. You want to read a text together. You want to try and presence that person, like Plato's perspective or Spinoza's perspective, not because you agree with it, but also don't disagree with it. Don't think at it and don't speak to people. Try to collectively give voice to it. So that you can more and more start to sense what it would be like to see the world in a Platonic fashion around, right? And see yourself and others in a Platonic fashion, or a Spinozistic fashion, or a Stoic fashion, or a Buddhist fashion. And so the idea there is to collectively come into a contemplative place where you're looking through the text and you're looking through what you say together, through in both meanings of the word, by means of and beyond, so that you can role model in a profound way the sage's way of seeing and being. And that's to cultivate a kind of companionship together, a fellowship around practice that has us coming into consonance and coherence with these powerful visions of the depths of what human beings can be and the depths of how the world can be disclosed to them. So that's the nature of the practice. Now, there's a bunch of, I mean, that sounds very abstract, but there's actually there's very specific procedures and sequences of procedures that I've taught that people can use to actually do what I'm talking about. And I see this as a seed practice. One of the things you do in oncology of practice is you layer them. I had a lot of feedback recently. I got some excellent feedback from Nick Winkelman on this very point. Really brilliant guy. His Language of Coaching, really important book. And he said, he said to me, I realize that you have all these things and then they layer and converge together, and that happens over time. And so what I mean by in ecology of practices is it should also layer. So I think that philosophical contemplative companionships train and are seed practices for a Neoplatonic practice down the road of dialectic, which I hope to also, as you probably know, Brett, I'm doing a lot of work on that with a lot of people to try and sort of reinventio that. So I think all of these are important because we have lost dialectic, which is a process of opponent processing and self-correcting. We have lost it in debate, which has become almost completely zero-sum and adversarial. And we have lost communing together. That's what I'm describing. And we have reduced it merely to communication, which we have then reduced to simply sending signal and trying to make sure that our signal gets to where we want it to go to do what we want it to do. And that is not conducive to wisdom, and it's not conducive to giving people the kinds of experiences that open them up to overcoming self-deception and to enhancing the connectedness to themselves, to each other, and to the world that is generative of increased meaning in life. So that's why there's so much hunger for these forms of dialogue and discourse that are centered on communing and the logos, as opposed to just communicating within debate. So that's what I would say about that.
Thanks so much, and hopefully some of you guys listening will want to join us as well. So, Mark, you have a question.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hey, John. I'm going to return your favor from the last time we talked and sort of ask you what actually may be a bit unfair and is sort of an indecent question in some sense, for which I'll apologize in advance, and feel free to skip any of the difficult parts of this sort of three-part thing that I think I can outline. So I'm having I'm literally struggling over the topic of addiction, and I'm wondering sort of in three aspects. Like, I see sort of two definitions of addiction, right? Anything that you're doing that's getting in the way of other things that you should be doing, right? And then I sort of realized rather recently, actually, that's a poor model. Some people are sort of slaves to their addiction, even though it's not, or not apparently, getting in the way of anything. And then, right, there's self-deception. So you can't use the first definition, because if there's self-deception, you won't even notice that you have that addiction. And then it seems to me like that fits into the meaning crisis in some important way that I'm not sort of understanding. I don't know what your thoughts are around that. So that I think you can address easily.
Clarification. Yeah. When you said that, do you mean that poor definition of addiction is
addiction?
Addiction itself is it? Okay. So I didn't know which this was. Sorry.
Yeah, it's because my thoughts are unclear on this, and this is a difficult topic for me for whatever reason. So, yeah, how does addiction fit into the meaning crisis, which is what I wrote down. I don't know why I can't read today. And then more on the more to the point, and maybe you shouldn't even touch this. And so again, I apologize. What are the practices like? How do we help release ourselves from addiction? Like what are the things that we can do to even practices that we can engage in that maybe we find addictions that we didn't know existed in some sense. So that those are the sort of the three layers that I want to, and feel free to riff on the definitions too, because I have never given this enough care, right? And so I'm sort of coming at this anew in some sense, which is strange to me. But yeah, anything you could go on riff on that topic would be great. Thank you.
That's great, Mark. So first of all, an important caveat: this is a part of my thinking that is still a work in progress. And maybe I don't mean that everything I'm doing is still a work in progress. What I mean by that is I'm not at a place where I'm completely satisfied, presenting it in any kind of recommended manner. But I want to. But I'm gonna let's do. So given that caveat, and given that what I am saying is not meant to be anything other than preliminary, why do I say that? Because as I did explicitly argue, and I'm confident about this first point, the model of addiction in our culture is going through a major transformation, and you're correct, Mark. So we had an old model, which was the disease model, and then the criteria for establishing that were exactly the ones that you gave, which is, well, how do we know when someone is diseased? Well, they are incapable of functioning normally, and they therefore need our help. Right, and of course, the degree of loss of functionality, like a cold, we maybe allow people a day off, but some diseases, like HIV, require significant intervention, and therefore you can put addictions on something analogous, a disease scale, and then you measure them by how dysfunctional people's lives get, and then what we'll do is we'll call it when people's lives are dysfunctional in three domains. Work, and relationship and basic health self-care. That's when a person's addicted. So, and that so that those diagnostic criteria, they had value. They did help to zero in on people that needed help. But they were based on a model, the disease model, that has been increasingly undermined by a lot of empirical evidence and by a lot of good theoretical argumentation, and that's where and I've seen many people doing this. The person who's taught me the most on this, and who's at the forefront of this, is Mark Lewis, and his notion that addiction is a learned behavior. It's reciprocal narrowing, and as I've mentioned before, the idea I got of understanding anagoge as reciprocal opening and the opposite of addiction came up in a dialogue I was having with Mark Lewis. And that leads me to a point that you, I think, were bringing up, which is addictions. If we see addiction as moving in the direction predominantly, because we're talking probabilistically, we're talking dispositionally, we're not talking about every moment of your life. If we say that people are predominantly moving in reciprocal narrowing, that should be thought of as in some way addictive. And if they're moving away from that reciprocal opening, that is in some way the ultimate therapeutic kind of response. But we should then broaden the notion of addiction much more comprehensively, and this this goes into what you talked about. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I think, Erich Fromm's modal confusion, in which people get locked into a vicious cycle of reciprocal narrowing because they get locked into the having mode. They lose access to the being mode. They can function, and this is part of Fromm's argument, and I'm going to steelman your point. They can function in our society. And Fromm's point is that's because our society is in some major ways insane. And that society is actually driving that modal confusion. And so although they are locked into reciprocal narrowing, they aren't meeting the sort of standard criteria given by the society of being functional. They're probably successful in their careers, and the fact that they've had several marriages, maybe that's a form of success. It means that they sort of are constantly trading up, and all the kinds of Frommian critiques. So the point is, when you use the standard criteria based on the really inadequate model of addiction, you have too narrow a scope of which you're looking for addiction. And I was going to say this when you mentioned that the sort of normal criteria. Even when people were using those criteria, they knew it was inadequate, because people can be functional to a very significant degree and still have all kinds of other markers, at least standard markers of addiction, but they're in a highly dysfunctional situation. They may have all kinds of people co-opted around them, enabling them, and therefore they don't lose their career, their health doesn't suffer, their relationships are managed by other people. And so the individualistic nature of that criteria is also misrepresenting. So when we talk about addiction and we move to this kind of more comprehensive model, we have to look at how self-deception can be masked not only by internal mechanisms like bias and parasitic processing, but also by external conditions, cultural cognitive grammars, socioeconomic institutions and structures that can prevent people from getting out of the kinds of reciprocal narrowing that nevertheless is dysfunctional in way. Like, notice how many people who would be satisfying standard criteria for not being addictive, but their reciprocal narrowing is starving them into a kind of zombie version of the meaning crisis, and they're totally unaware of it. But they lack meaning in life, and therefore they have a tremendous brittleness at the level of mental health, in terms of moral aspiration, etc. So I think that we need to more deeply think about addiction in terms of reciprocal narrowing. We need to make central self-deception and how self-deception bleeds out into things that were not considered medically forms of addiction, and that has to do not only with internal processes, but external environments. The agent-arena relationship, of course, is paramount in my mind. And what that means to me is that I think, obviously, people should. I want to make this really clear. People still should be pursuing, therapeutic interventions, both individual and group therapies. They should pursue therapies that are increasingly more embodied than just sort of standard CBT and things like that. But I think we're coming to the realization. This is where, again, I feel most incomplete in what I'm saying and most tenuous, but we're coming to the realization that a lot of addictions, not the way I've now more broadly construed them and portrayed them, they require a sacred response. And you say, that's crazy. Well, is it? We know that something that looks a lot like sacredness, which is, a mixture of, a psychedelic to enhance cognitive flexibility, and then a ritual narrative situation like therapy, that combination is way more powerful for dealing with depression. And the thing about depression is it doesn't fall under our standard definitions of addiction, but man, does it ever fall under reciprocal narrowing and parasitic processing and having environmental factors as well as internal factors. And so opening up the idea that we need a sacred dimension in the response to a lot of addiction, I think is important. Now, many of you are saying, and this is a good point, I'm acknowledging it, well, that sort of spiritual dimension has always been present, with Alcoholics Anonymous, or, there's a Buddhist version for Alcoholics Anonymous that makes use of the Eightfold Path rather than a Christian framework. It's actually, by the way, empirically seems to be more successful than AA. I don't know what that says. It doesn't say that Buddhism is more true than Christianity or anything ridiculous about that. It points to the point I'm trying to make is, yeah, but we could get better at understanding the sacredness, and we could do better at implementing it and integrating it and using it in how we respond to individual addiction. But we also would then turn it outward and need to, in a coordinated fashion, use it to respond to collective cultural addictions. So that's nowhere near enough, Mark. It's inadequate in a lot of ways. There's lots of lacuna in what I said, but that's where my thinking is at right now about that.
Wow, that was as always, John. That was fantastic. That was a lot more comprehensive, we'll say, than I thought. And then just quickly, is there anything you think in terms of practices? I mean, I didn't know this about the Eightfold Path and the AA, because AA I always thought was the best. But is there anything in terms of practices to sort of overcome the self-deception about, say, whether or not we're depressed? Because to your point, yeah, it looks like an addiction, and then treatment. Is there, other than just like sacredness, is there something you can point to specifically, maybe as part of the meditation ecology of practices series that you're teaching? Or
I do think a richly layered ecology of practice that is oriented both internally and externally, like we're trying to do in the Sangha, has the highest plausibility and probability, plausibility in the sense in terms of its intelligibility and justification, and probability in terms of prediction of its success, for doing what you said, getting people to realize. In fact, so I don't have scientific evidence, but I have close to 2 decades of anecdotal evidence that this is often what happens when people enter these wisdom pathways. They come in for one reason. Let me like a standard example. I want to meditate because I want to relax and get rid of stress. And as they do this, they start to see forms of self-deception that they were not aware of, that are sort of underlying and causing, but deeper than the stress factors. And then they start to wake up to that. And they do that because of the practices, but the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. They do it because of the practices. They do it because they get a new cultural cognitive grammar by which they can articulate and reflect. And they get it because of a Sangha. They get it because of groups of people through which they can self-transcend and self-correct. So I think, that has the greatest plausibility and probability of helping people awaken to forms of self-deception that are so self-masking that people are not even initially aware of them.
That's great. Thanks, John. I appreciate it. I apologize for the difficult question, but as usual, you handled it excellently. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark, for saying that. And thank you for your charitability. I appreciate that.
Close to the end of our time. I think, Raoul, do you have a comment?
Yeah, hi, John. Actually, I would like to use this chance to say thank you very, very much. First of all, I'm so lucky for knowing you. I actually have no question, but there's a lot of things to thank you for, so I'm not going to count them all, but 2 things stand out them. The first of them is thank you very much for providing a platform in the Sangha, where there is a feeling of relatedness and looking forward into the future for love, for wisdom. And second thing is that as a student of cognitive neuroscience, I want to thank you for being an ideal in my life, which is something I'm missing so much in academia today in my life. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for saying that, Raoul. That's very that touches me deeply, both in different ways. It's very encouraging to me. It's very encouraging to me. So I thank you for thanking me.
It's from my heart, from the depth to the depth, from immersions to immersions, as you said.
Thank you very much for that. I like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thanks, John. Again, that was another great session. To remind everybody, so we're changing our schedule a little bit because John's getting back to the grind of the fall semester, and so we're going to be doing these Q&As on the last Monday of the month. We're going to have a little bit of a time change. They're going to move from 6 till 6:30 Eastern, but they're going to go for 90 minutes. So the last Monday of the month from 6:30 till 8 is how we're going to be moving forward. And again, thanks, John, and thanks everyone for being here today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Also.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks, John and Brett. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take good care. Have a good evening.